Awesome. Thanks everyone for coming today. We know that there are a lot of sessions to choose from, so we appreciate your time here today. My name is Tammy Champo. I work for HDR. And if we want to have everybody introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Melissa Phillips. I also work for HDR.
And I'm Eileen Barron. I'm the Region 3 Communications Manager.
Vince Izzo with HDR and the only non-public involvement person at the table.
Our resident NEPA expert.
Don't hold it against him. I affectionately call him the NEPA god. Must bow down to him. Awesome. So we are going to be talking about leveraging online tools in the NEPA process. And sort of a background for you, we have recently developed a NEPA online tools guidance document that we're going to be referring to. A lot of the information that we're presenting today comes directly from that. We do have a few copies of it today if you want a hard copy. And then we're also going to be working with the Central Communications team to get that uploaded onto the public involvement page. And it will also be on in the environmental page, redirected to the public involvement page. So if you're curious, check in a couple of days online, and it should be online. Okay, so really quickly, just a few objectives of our workshop. We are going to be talking about the role that public involvement plays in the NEPA process specifically. So today, we know that public involvement covers a large range of different types of projects and different areas where we can work, but specifically we're talking about NEPA today. And then we want to talk about how those online tools and social media can help inform and connect with stakeholders in projects. So utilizing these new tools that are coming out to make sure that we're reaching our audience. We want to talk about this guidance document and some recommended best practices for how to use these new tools, and then also recommend some different methods for comment management.
So, can you hear me? Okay. When it comes to public involvement and the NEPA process, there's a bit of a balancing act that has to take place. It's really easy to think only public engagement, or we need public comment. We need to make sure that the public's voices are heard. But there's also a portion about supporting the NEPA process and also protecting UDOT's legal defensibility. So when we come to a project, it's important to consider your plan. It's important to consider why you're conducting outreach in the first place. Eileen, do you have any comments?
So this is always kind of a tension, I think, in the NEPA process, because when we do public outreach during construction, it's really about the information and reaching stakeholders. But in NEPA, there are some guidelines, and we want to be sensitive to the bigger picture of what's happening in that decision-making process, because NEPA is intended to be a decision-making process. And there's a public process that goes with that. And I guess what I just emphasized, that I feel it's really important to view public involvement in a supporting role to the NEPA process, and that the public outreach component in the public process is there to support the technical analysis and the public process that is outlined in the National Environmental Policy Act.
Yeah, and I'll just add, when first starting NEPA many years ago, it was all about the input, because the whole purpose of it for the NEPA process is so that we can build a better document, understand what people's concerns are, so that we analyze those and that we maybe change a project over and alternatives for it. But I think we also realize that there is the aspect of getting out and informing the public about the project and the benefits of the project. So it is kind of twofold. But from a defensibility standpoint, the underlying piece is that we do need that information. And when we're gearing our plan, we need to think about that that is a primary goal.
Yes, and that actually brings up a good point, that nowadays the public is becoming more savvy about what their rights are and their abilities to make comments and to have their voices heard. It's not uncommon for a project to be delayed simply because of public opinion and possibly it becoming controversial. When it comes to moving forward with PI, we are really, you're going to hear this a lot in our session, and it's going to be about determining the right approach. I think we have pretty tried and true methods when it comes to construction and public involvement. But when it comes to NEPA, sometimes we tend to mirror our public outreach efforts as we would with a construction project. And we may not realize that the objectives for a NEPA project are a lot different. So when it comes to developing your plan, the first thing you want to do is consider your audience. I know that's kind of like PI 101. It's like the most basic building block of any outreach plan. But it's really important that if you're going to move forward, you really think about who you're talking to and who you're connecting with. Also important to consider what tools you will use. This is where it comes into online tools and social media and how you'll connect with the public. There's not a one-size-fits-all. So just because something becomes available, it's not necessarily the right choice. We move forward with the PI plan, developing it, and ultimately getting input from our PM, our RCM, the team, and then we move forward with it. We implement and we monitor it. And then obviously we would circle back with our own team to give them updates and keep them in the loop about how effective things are going, what could be improved, and maybe what input we're getting from the public.
So we're going to talk about a few of the different options that we have for online tools. Obviously, these options are continually growing, and just to follow up on what Melissa was saying, sometimes a new tool comes out, and it's like the tried and true method of using good communications kind of gets thrown out the window because people get excited about it. But it's really good to step back and look at what is the purpose of it and what are we trying to accomplish. So a few of these options that we have: the online interactive maps, website comment forms, crowdsourcing, and social media. Online interactive maps is something that is relatively new with some of the UDOT projects, and it can be both a benefit and a resource. It can either be a method where you get a lot of comments, a lot more than you were planning, but it can also help save time. And Vince, I wanted to give you some time to talk about how an online interactive map can help answer some of the questions that in the past might have required a lot of time from some of our different project teams.
For the NEPA process, when we were doing, and this is where I think the online interactive maps, you need to look at what's the right tool. But for example, when we did Mountain View initially, 30-mile corridor, we had a lot of inquiries about where's the corridor in relationship to my house? How is it going to affect my development? We would get these inquiries every week, and every week we were spending time producing maps, responding to people. It was pretty time intensive. West Davis Corridor, newer technologies came up. We posted interactive GIS map that people could zoom in down to their house, look at the aerial, look exactly where the alignment was going. We basically eliminated all that inquiry from the public because they could just do it online. That's very effective. It was worth the effort of developing that tool because of the amount of time we saved. I look at another project like the 600 West EIS where we had a new interchange off of Bangerter Highway. Probably not really effective. We really only had about 15 interested stakeholders that were just businesses. No one else really cared about the project. So producing that level of effort wouldn't have made sense for that project, where really what you needed to do was just work with those 15 stakeholders on an individual basis.
And since I believe they're going to be putting all of these online. If any of you didn't make it to the GIS presentation the first day, they really walked through some of the different apps that they've developed for Mountain View Corridor, and it shows a really good example of that, where you can zoom right in on the intersection where you live, and you can see what the planned initial phase build out versus full build out, and you can see a lot of these different things. That those tools are really effective to reach our audiences and make sure that they have some ability to give some input. So specifically about social media, we're not going to spend a lot of time on social media because this is an area where with NEPA, it's a little bit of unknown territory, and especially using social media to gather input and to gather comments for NEPA. We may not necessarily be ready for this at UDOT, but we wanted to make sure that we covered a couple of these things, that social media can be used to monitor the public discussion. It can be used not so much in your comment gathering period, but just to get a really good pulse of what people are saying about the planned project and what their opinions are. You can broadcast information. You can let them know about upcoming public meetings where they can come and make some formal comments. Obviously, you're gathering information. You can receive those comments, and we're going to be talking a little bit later about the different types of comments and how they're used in the NEPA process. And then also just engaging with your stakeholders, building that relationship with them early on in the process so that they feel like they're a part of this process and they know that their voice is heard.
So I'll just chime in for a minute. This list comes out of a piece of research that was sponsored by the National Cooperative Highway NCHRP research program that I worked on in 2013. And if you're interested in diving deeper into what's happening nationally in terms of use of social media in the NEPA process, there are 6 case studies in this research that you can access the full report, as well as there's a guidance resource for how to think through using social media as a tool during NEPA in particular, and that's available at nepaandsocialmedia.com. And that takes you to an online tool matrix where you can explore some of the different types of social tools, but under the resources tab, you can access the full report, which is about 80 pages, and then the 20-page guidance resource document.
Thank you. Do you have any other comments to add about social media?
Just, I'd say if you want to dive deeper, that's a great resource. It was published now almost, 2 years ago, so some of the information in terms of the tools might starting to get stale, but the approach, and then of course, NEPA is still the same. Yeah. So that's just available to you, and want to point you in that direction if you'd like to think about this more. And those 6 case studies help demonstrate a range of uses, that there is some precedent. And I think a lot of DOTs are kind of moving carefully into the social media realm during NEPA because there is certainly no legal precedence if there is a legal challenge. And then there's just a handful really of examples out there in terms of just practice-wise what kind of precedent is out there. But there are 6 case studies there that you can read more about.
Great. So we're going to start, unfortunately for you, we've only got 10-ish people in here, but we want to do some audience participation, some discussion, because we want to hear from you what you think would be the right approach considering the situation. So we've developed a few scenarios along the way. Just, there's no right or wrong answer in these things, but we'd really like to hear from you and get your ideas about how you would approach something. And then we're going to turn it over to Eileen and Vince and also get their perspective of recommendations they might have. So because I know a lot of you in here, none of you are safe, I will call on you if nobody speaks up. So, so get your thinking caps on. But let's start with our first scenario. Our first scenario is you just started a project in an area that is historic in nature with many long-term residents, but also an emerging population with the construction of new multi-use development. The new housing includes many young families and retirees looking to downsize. Your company has access to a new visioning online tool, such as MindMixer. Is this the right tool to use considering the elderly stakeholders in the area? Okay, any comments, any thoughts? What would be your approach in this situation? I know, I'm looking at you, Jeff.
No, I'm actually working on a project up in Ogden where we have people who are in their 80s and 90s. There are some who do use the internet, but others, this type of tool would not work for the elderly stakeholders as effectively as it would for the younger generation, just
So how are you connecting with your elderly stakeholders?
A lot of it has been more with one-on-ones, or trying to meet with some of the groups that they associate with, because they're more comfortable in that type of setting.
Yeah, I mean, it's something to consider because just with the emergence of online tools, and especially from a public involvement perspective, I mean, they're real appealing. It's definitely looks, it's definitely an attractive option. But some of these old school methods that we've used of in-person meetings and flyer delivery and that sort of thing, they're not irrelevant. They definitely have their place, and this is what it goes back to, developing a plan and evaluating your stakeholders and your project, and ultimately the objectives you're trying to accomplish. Are there any other thoughts or comments?
Maybe just playing devil's advocate. So considering you do have an elderly population, but you also have a younger generation that's emerging that has young families, how are you making sure that you're connecting with them with the type of audience that may not show up to a typical public meeting or may not engage in other one-to-one methods?
You could offer both. You could do the social media tools for the one group and one-on-one meetings for the other group and see if that's effective or.
Yeah, absolutely. Just in case, I know we're a little spread out, but there's not a lot of us. But absolutely, you can definitely you can approach both ideas. And it's not that one size fits all. The one-on-one approach might not fit for everyone. The online tools may not fit for everyone, but you can definitely look at the different tools and just evaluate, is this the right method? Is this the right tactic for my project? Vince and Eileen, do you guys want to add?
Yeah, a couple of things. When you look at this, what are you trying to get from this group of people? What's the information that's going to benefit the NEPA process and us looking at alternatives, evaluating impacts, and then kind of look at what's the right tool to get that information. And the other thing is, and I just was thinking of this, you're talking a younger group, which will think a lot differently about the project than the older group. Is there a public involvement tool that you can get the two together to understand their different viewpoints and work together for the project? Because they will think a lot differently, and we run across that a lot in large-scale projects. The older community, tends to be more accepting of it, and the younger community is more energized about maybe facts or figures and things. But if you can get the two to work together sometimes, it's really interesting.
Well, and I think another key point is anytime you're going to use an online tool for public outreach, you need to make sure you're counterbalancing that with something that's accessible without a computer or without internet. And particularly in NEPA, you want to demonstrate the accessibility to a variety of populations. And so even though there's certainly some efficiencies and some advantages of using online tools to reach certain audiences, we need to continue to recognize not everyone has access to those tools, and you need to come up with specific strategies that either provide them access, maybe in a special setting, or having something duplicate or something similar in a hard copy format or one-on-one meetings or something else that counterbalances.
Thank you. Those were both very helpful comments. We have another scenario. Since Jeff made a comment in the last one, he's off the hook for now. I'm making eye contact over here. Our next scenario is you're working on a project that covers a large area in a rural community with stakeholders spread out between long distances. The local city has expressed interest in online tools. Which ones would you recommend and why? Any thoughts on this?
I think the maps where you've got one piece where you can locate where you, or put on the map where you're located and make your comments associated to that. It's really helpful in these kind of scenarios where they're not all commenting on the same area. They all have their own personal concerns, so then you can identify, and then you almost can follow up with them because when it's that spread out, you can go to that neighborhood and knock on doors
Yes, thank you. And if anybody didn't hear, Gemma was speaking on online interactive maps where you can make your comment right online where you're in a specific designated point. Anybody else? Yeah, Jeff.
Depending on the group, on the types of groups that are in those rural communities, some are tied to social media. So you can use social media to help broadcast that what's going on and about the project, to then engage them to give their comment.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Yes.
I'd put some kind of a link on probably like a city, I mean, every town in the city typically have a website. From there, you can link something off of that, or it's wherever it comes together.
You know, and that's a great point, because that's something to consider in terms of using other cities, counties, I don't know, other stakeholders' outreach channels online, because it's a free resource in a sense. So you kind of save yourself money, but you're able to kind of extend your reach just a little bit more. I use that a lot in a lot of my PI projects, and I found it's really helpful because you can actually customize your approach to whatever like the city's website is, or their social media channels, or whatever they have found that works especially well for them. Vince, Eileen, any thoughts on this?
I think it really comes down to defining the purpose of using the tool. You know, I'd go back to the city and really try to dig into, well, what is their interest in an online tool? Why do they think it will be a good method to reach these people who may be spread out over a rural area? And I think if we can explain why we think it's going to be effective and how it's going to be used, you know, I'm in full support of using a tool. If you can demonstrate that it's been thought through and that there's a plan in place for the why and how, and then the what, I think becomes fairly easy.
And the thing to remember too, especially in some rural communities, although Utah's probably unique in being one of the most connected states in the country, but some rural communities may not be all that connected. So always keep that in mind, like, oh, we got this great online tool, and then only 50% of the people, either because of income or other reasons, are connected. Then you're missing half your audience. So this gets back to Eileen, which is make sure you also have other methods for people to provide that input as well.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so before we dive into the different types of comments and how we're managing those comments in the NEPA process, we wanted to make sure we just walked through a little bit about what is the comment process in NEPA. And we talked about this a little bit in the beginning, that a lot of times if consultants have been working on a lot of construction projects, those comments are used very differently than the way they're used in NEPA. For construction, it's more just information gathering. We're dealing with issues and helping them to identify the resources to resolve their issues. With NEPA, we're really gathering input. And there are formal comment periods where the comments that they are turning into us, those are become part of the decision-making process as we're developing our environmental documents. So just walking through the steps really quickly, obviously there's the scoping process, there's the purpose and need, and then also the alternatives analysis. Those two areas of the NEPA process are probably where those public comments can be the most useful in helping guide the direction of a project. After that, you have the notice of availability of a draft environmental document, public comment on the draft environmental document, so they can still be turning in those formal and informal comments, notice of availability of final environmental document, and then, of course, the decision document once a decision's been made. So as we sat down and as we looked at the different types of tools available, we looked at the different ways that people can interact with a project team, we realized that although there are formal comment periods, not every medium that stakeholders can use necessarily fits for a public comment. So for UDOT, this is a new This is a new guidance that we're rolling out with this guidance document that we're asking project teams to take into consideration. But there are really 3 different types of comments. There's the formal comments during the formal comment period. Those are really typical when you have the formal comment form that people can fill out in person, in paper, at a public meeting. There's the email that they can email the project team, or there's also the online comments on a project website. Those are typically the most common methods that people would use for a formal comment. Then you have correspondence. These can be the same methods, but it might be during a time that isn't a formal comment period, or they might just be asking questions. They don't necessarily want to make a formal comment. And then there's also informal, which is a lot of the tools that we've been talking about today. There's the interactive online tools, social media, maps, and crowdsourcing that are more casual in nature. And these formats, we are recommending that these should be considered informal. They're not something that needs to necessarily be part of the document, but it is something to consider during the process.
Yeah, so this comment definition is really what I think is new to the conversation, and what this guidance that's been vetted through UDOT's environmental group really helps bring into focus. Because that's one of the challenges if you're looking at using a social media or an online tool during NEPA. One of the things that's really important is to define what are you doing with those comments. Are they considered formal comments or informal comments? And so what this guidance does is, for UDOT NEPA projects, is we are defining online and social media tools as informal comments. And that maybe means more to our NEPA practitioners than to the general public by far, but I think as PI practitioners, you need to be aware of this distinction, that the formal comments during a formal comment period require a response, and they go into the formal record for the decision-making process. Whereas the informal comments comes at any time in the process, and we might respond because we want to engage with our stakeholders, or maybe we want to get more information from them. But there's not a requirement to respond, and it's more informational to the project team. It's often, letting us know about maybe a water feature that we didn't know about, or so there's discovery or a general feeling or attitude about an alternative, for instance. But if they want to kind of submit a formal comment that goes in the record, we need to point them towards these formal comment methods that we're defining, which is generally a comment form, website, or email.
And I'll just add, I know we're saying informal. Any comment, whether it be on some kind of social media website or something, that process that you use somewhere needs to be documented in the NEPA process as an outreach that you've done. That way, if we ever go to court, you can say, yeah, we did all these things, including this. I mean, we gave everybody the ability to provide some sort of input. And I would even say that I know whether you can somehow you save those informal comments somewhere. Yes, you don't need to respond to them, but you put them somewhere. And typically in the back of a NEPA document or a separate memo, we say, yes, we got this, and here's what we did with it. Just to let, if it ever gets to the lawsuit, yeah, we did get these this way. This is how we used them, and this is what we did with them.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the idea of legal defensibility. Understanding the different types of comments really, at the end of the day, protects the project and protects the owner. I think we all know, either directly or have heard through the grapevine, of projects that have suffered legal delays. And by following a good process to begin with, we protect ourselves, and we ultimately help to advance the project. One of the things that we have recently drafted are 2 disclaimers, a formal comment disclaimer and an informal disclaimer, or an informal comment disclaimer. I won't read this for you, it's kind of long and dry, but the point behind it is that when we are using our online tools, or even like our our comment sheets, our websites, whatever tools you're using to solicit comments, we need to start implementing these disclaimers. It's important for people to understand when they are making a comment that they know that this is going to become a matter of public record. It does not mean that we're going to broadcast their information, but it now becomes incorporated into the environmental document, especially if it's a formal comment.
And I do want to add that
Yes,
that's,
please.
that really is clear. You know, we can't say your information will be kept confidential, because it can't be. It's on a public website, it's in a public process. If someone uses the state process or the federal process to request the information, it's got to be given over. So, you know, we can redact names, but that comment, that information, you know, we do have to release it. And the other point behind this is just to give them the public a good understanding of what we're going to do with their information. Are we going to respond to them directly? Are we not? How it's going to be used, just so it's clear. And you don't need to put the whole disclaimer up there on the website. You know, you can have a little link off to the side, and if they're interested, they can open it, but at least it's available.
Yeah, we talked about pop-up boxes,
Yeah.
right? It could just pop up on the screen. I think this brings back goes back to the idea of balancing public involvement with the NEPA process. Eileen, you've mentioned a lot about how we don't want to scare our stakeholders from participating, but we still need to protect the project. Can you elaborate on that more?
Yeah, so it is a fine balance, and you know, how we use this disclaimer, I think we're going to kind of see how it works. On a website, it makes sense to have a link to it so that people can find it and dig into it. How we use it, if we use it in its entirety or portions of it on an actual like hard copy comment form, I think as we engage in the NEPA process, that's something that I'm interested in seeing how it works, and I think we'll have some discussion around that, about how much of this language do you want to inundate people with? Because again, I think from the public's perspective, they don't necessarily have an awareness of the difference between a formal comment and an informal comment. But I think what is important, as Vince referred to, is making them aware of what happens with their comment and that it does become part of a public record. And so we cannot make a promise of confidentiality to their comment because it's part of a public process. So it is discoverable and can be queried. There was a question.
I think that the disclaimer is a great idea. I got an emailed comment this morning from a lady who, luckily this is a planning study, not a NEPA study, but it was full of profanity and her name was on it. And I don't know if she knows that that is something that can be disseminated to everybody, but if she did, I don't know if she would have written it the way she wrote.
Yeah, so it's really trying to set expectations and make sure people are aware that it is a public process and that their comment becomes part of a public record.
And I think the proper use of these disclaimers is really key when you work with your PMs and your RCMs. Something that you said that brought to my mind was the idea that we may not have to put these in a certain location, or we can choose where we put it. And ultimately, it's a team effort. We want to make sure that we are protecting ourselves.
Okay, your favorite part. This is where you get to talk. So we're going to do another scenario. You've set up an interactive map with comment features for a large EIS project that has become controversial. You received more than 1,000 comments within a few short weeks of opening up the interactive map for public comment. How do you balance an appropriate response level with available resources?
Yeah, go ahead. I think that they deserve a response that tells them that their comment was received, and it can be an automated response. And then you have to read them all anyway, so I think you can pull out the ones that are actually asking questions and answer the ones that are asking questions, and then everyone else just gets the robo answer.
Yeah, absolutely. So using an automated response so that everyone knows that at least it was received and acknowledged, but those who are asking specific questions, maybe answer them back. Yeah.
I think when you do go through those comments, if there's a general issue or problem that some of the people are having, you can take what they are asking and do a little bit of a Q&A. And that way for future comments, they already have those answers directly like on a website or something that's accessible.
No, that's great. Sometimes you see recurring themes and recurring issues that a lot of people are bringing up. And perhaps it's something that someone might not have written in about, but they're also thinking about. So that's a great opportunity to post up an FAQ on your website and really dive into some of those common issues that people are asking about. We had another comment over here.
Idea that's similar to what she was saying, that if you can identify those common themes and kind of group them together, particularly if there's going to be a level of response or of addressing those issues as they move forward with the process, it's helpful for the team that's reviewing that to be able to see, you know, we have some general issues in this category, so they don't have to go down so deep into every one of those comments.
And these are all great ideas to show that an online tool can be used to gather more input than you might have received in the traditional formats, but it also doesn't mean that you have to overload your team by responding individually to each of these, by using some of those automated features or using some of these
Frequently asked questions.
Say what?
Frequently asked questions.
Frequently asked questions, yes. Where you take everything and you summarize it. That's the word I was looking for. Yes.
So when posting the responses on the website, that qualify as responding, even if you don't notify the individual respondent or commenter, you're responding to them personally?
I think the idea is going back to the automated response, that your automated response would need to say something to the effect of, thank you for your comment, it has been received and will be reviewed. After, 15 days, we will be posting an FAQ on the website, so please check back for more information. And if you feel like and we'll contact you if that doesn't address your concern. Does that make sense?
Well, and I think that's also where these comment definitions become very helpful to a project team, because in between those formal comment periods where response is required, to define the other types of interactions as informal, not requiring individual response. Because we know as PI practitioners, it's good practice to give that feedback of what's happened. And when we have those common themes, an FAQ or comment summary becomes a very appropriate way to reflect back what the project team has done with the information that's been shared. So I think those comment definitions then become very useful, and understanding that you don't necessarily have to provide individual response to every informal comment, but we can do it more in a thematic way or through an FAQ or some other method.
And I will say too, if you already know that you have a project that may become controversial, or you know that once you put this online tool up that you're going to be starting to receive those comments in, it's helpful as you're creating your plan. You need to have some of those things already drafted. You have to have that automated response already drafted before you push, before the green light and it becomes available, because otherwise you start getting all these responses, you don't have the automated response turned on, and then you're trying to play catch up. So it's helpful in the planning process to make sure that you're prepared and that you've thought through all of these steps before you push publish.
Yeah, and just to follow up, one thought is the idea of qualitative and quantitative comments. Eileen, can you talk about this a little bit? Getting a lot of comments doesn't necessarily mean you're getting an informed stakeholder input.
Right, so oftentimes if you're hit with that 1,000 submissions, I'll call them submissions because sometimes it's just an opinion without any substance. Or you're getting a form letter that people are copy and pasting over. And so I think it's important, particularly during NEPA, that you're aware of what comments coming in have substantive information in it, and sometimes you have the same thing over and over again, and so you could kind of, even though you've got 500 comments, really 80% of them can be addressed with one statement or one FAQ question, right? So keeping things in perspective. And even because you get a lot of comments doesn't mean, I mean, we want the quality, right? We want to hear meaningful feedback and be gaining information. And so just checking off, the number of comments received may not really tell the story of the public input you're getting into your NEPA process.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the idea of evaluating the proper tools. I think, truthfully, as a PI person, I would probably be a little excited if I started getting a lot of comments. I would love to kind of get involved in something that deep and that meaty, but it's a really good point. Just because it's accessible and you're getting a lot of comments, are you getting substantive feedback? And that may not be the case. And I think it's something to consider if you know it will be a controversial project, and you know that maybe the extent of your comments might be just more inflammatory or negative, it may not actually help the purpose of the project.
So similar to the formal comment disclaimer, there's an informal comment disclaimer. This is similar in that, you don't have to post the full thing. We don't want to scare people, but maybe just a link to it. But the idea is that we're letting them know that this is really not the way to make a formal comment. And if they do want to make a formal comment, then they need to use those formal comment methods that have already been determined by the project team, be it the website, an email, or that they can write something and mail it in. So
I just say the key thing here is directing people over to where a formal comment can be made, especially during your formal comment periods. So if you're maintaining an online interactive map on through and during a formal comment period, that there's some statement on your map that, comments made on this map are for informational purposes only. If you want to submit a formal comment in the NEPA process, click here for the web comment form, or email this address. And if you dig into that NCHRP study, you'll see that's kind of the direction several agencies have gone in terms of keeping their social space informal and redirecting people to a specific location for the formal comments.
Okay, we're on the home stretch. We have one last scenario to talk over. So this one is your internal PM asked you to put up a website for comment management. You put it up without checking with your RCM, and you assumed your PM was checking in with the UDOT PM to get approvals. You learned later that the proper process was not followed correctly and no disclaimer language was posted on the site. What do you do? I feel like there's a lot of answers, but any thoughts on this?
Go to your RCM and you start begging for forgiveness.
Yeah, a good point. Anything else?
What I like about that answer, though, is don't waste time. If an issue comes up, regardless, I think it's good to make sure that you immediately notify UDOT, because ultimately you may be the consultant on that project, but they're the owners of the project. And so making sure that they're aware of an issue is really critical, and making sure that they're aware of it in a timely fashion. And obviously sometimes steps get missed, sometimes approvals are not made in the right order, and that's okay. And that's where you have an opportunity to step in and say, you know what, we didn't follow the right process, but how can we fix this now to make sure that from moving forward that we are following the process that UDOT would prefer. Yeah.
I think that's really a great point, and I just would add to that what you said, to touch on what you said a little bit more, how important it is, because we do all make mistakes, that we don't try to run from those. Let's, identify, or as soon as you identify that a mistake was made, go and talk to the appropriate people, because they have more knowledge a lot of times than we do.
less painful, the key phrase right there. Yeah, there's a lot of, I think, different ways to approach this scenario or ways to interpret it. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you just started, trekking ahead with a project or a task and then realized maybe you hadn't followed the proper protocol. I've never done it, but I've heard it's terrible. But I can say that ultimately, we come back to the idea of a plan, a process, and keeping our people informed. We're communications people, and sometimes maybe we aren't communicating with our clients and our team members. And so I like the idea of going back to make a plan, stick to it, work with your people so that everyone's on the same page and the goals are not getting overlooked.
Yeah, I'll just second that. I think if you've done a good public involvement plan and engaged both the UDOT and consultant project manager as well as the RCM, you should avoid that situation, right? Because everything should have been talked through. But of course, we all know there are situations depending on the scale of the project or time and availability. Someone's gone on vacation for a week, that sometimes we do miss a step. So I like the discussion here that, this is a pretty easy fix, right? We can get the disclaimer up there pretty quickly. We can, kind of go back and make sure everyone's comfortable with this comment documentation or comment management system. But really, the point is to avoid the situation through good planning up front.
Yes, thank you. Vince, do you have any thoughts?
Just in summary, I think we really need to think through the whole process, what we're trying to do, our goals like we've talked about, and the implementation of it. And I'll give an example. Worked on a large controversial project, and at one of these public meetings, we had thousands of people turn out. The public involvement team decided, we're going to make it live so people can just get on their computers, send us responses, and we can respond back. I wasn't really happy about that for two reasons. One reason is we're having people at the computer responding back that probably aren't the ones with this really good knowledge of the response to give, and we're giving a live response back to these people. That's going to come back to haunt you one day if someone says something wrong in that response back. The second thing is this whole system crashed during the middle. We had so many people online, it crashed, and it really got a lot of people upset because they didn't attend the meeting because they were going to do this format, and then they couldn't access it. So think things through.
Yeah, well, and let me just point out one thing that hasn't been raised about the relationship of NEPA and social media. And I know this is a discussion I've had with Brandon Weston on several occasions, that NEPA is a very kind of slow-moving, methodical analysis and assessment. And social media is real-time, quick, and there's an expectation of immediacy. And there's something very incongruous about that. And I think that's also why at this point in time, for us at UDOT, using social media as an outreach tool for informal comments feels appropriate, because NEPA, there's not that immediacy within the NEPA process. That may happen on a construction job when you have a lane closure that's unexpected and there's a lot of traffic impact happening now. NEPA is not making big changes overnight. It's a slow, methodical process. And so I guess I just challenge you to think about that element of time, and where I think, when you said that live response, it hasn't necessarily been reviewed, but then now it's out there, and, was it correct information or not becomes, this is why we do a lot of preparation of anyone who's staffing a public meeting in a NEPA process, because we want to make sure we're giving good information and reliable, consistent information. And so that's one of the reasons I think at UDOT we're holding back on social media for formal comments, because also, we're studying this in a very deep way. How can you get a deep, meaningful comment in 140 characters? And that's really, I'm echoing back what I was hearing from colleagues across the country who were looking at, in these case studies, how can we use social media during NEPA? So that, how the NEPA process works and then the expectations of online interaction, that's something we need to continue to have dialogue about, so how can we use it most effectively? and get the most out of it as an outreach tool that can support the NEPA process and getting a really informed and meaningful dialogue going on with key stakeholders.
Thank you. Those are very helpful comments. All right, we are reaching the end of our session. Just to recap our presentation, the role of public involvement is for the NEPA process is different than it would be for a construction project. For NEPA, you're here to support input. You're here to support an analysis. When you move forward with your PI approach, make sure that you give it careful thought and consideration and you plan appropriately. That really isn't different for any project or any task you might do, but planning really is key. And then lastly, your informal comments, they can complement your formal comments. They are different than your formal comments, and it's important to understand the different comment types, as we've discussed already, and the different disclaimers. But informal comments still have their place too, and that's where online tools and social media come into play. Are there any other questions before we go with our esteemed panel of NEPA experts? All right. Oh, Jeff.
Just a question, with local governments, is this something that the department is going to, especially the environmental division, is going to encourage them to incorporate some of these things into their processes?
I think definitely there needs to be discussion around that. And I don't know, Jennifer, do you have anything to add related to when local governments are running a NEPA process?
Thought it through to that level. It might just depend on the project and the local government, and if it's appropriate, if they have that capability, if there's an interest.
Well, and I
Perhaps
think-
providing a recommendation.
Yeah, well, and I think the other piece of this is as UDOT assumes NEPA delegation, and we have authority to sign off on these documents, and kind of putting our stamp of approval on their legal defensibility and compliance with the law. Certainly, I think those local government NEPA documents are probably going to hit our desk with that NEPA delegation, and so we would want to probably follow this guidance.
Great, thank you. Any other comments?
I have one last thing.
Yes, please.
If you're going to lunch, we have a group of public involvement folks that are going to gather together in the front left tables. I think, so Sydney Jakes is our Utah representative for the Intermountain chapter of International Association for Public Participation, or IAP2, and she's just created an opportunity for us to get together and have lunch together so we can talk and get to know each other. You don't have to be a member of IAP2 to join us. If you have any remote interest in public participation as it relates to what we do here at UDOT and for transportation in Utah, please join us. Front left, look for 4 tables reserved for PI.
I know Vince is really looking
Oh,
forward to
communications, even broader than just PI, which is awesome.
that. Well, thank you for attending our session. We hope you learned a few things, and if you have any other questions, let us know. Thank you.